Summer 1968. Harlem's underworld is about to witness something nobody saw coming. A funeral becomes a chess move. A briefcase becomes a statement, and a man everyone underestimated is about to rewrite the rules of organized crime in America. This is the story of Frank Lucas, not the Hollywood version, not the legend, but the calculated strategy behind one of the most audacious power plays in criminal history. And it starts with a question nobody was asking. What happens when the person holding power together suddenly disappears? To understand what Frank Lucas did, you need to understand the system he was operating in. By 1968, Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood, it was an economy, an underground economy worth tens of millions annually, controlled by a delicate balance of power. At the top sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. For over 3 decades, Bumpy had done something extraordinary. He'd maintained black autonomy in a world dominated by Italian organized crime. The 5 families controlled New York, but Bumpy had negotiated a rare arrangement. Harlem could govern itself for a price. 20% of everything went to the Italian syndicates. In return, Harlem's operations stayed black-owned, black-run. It was an uneasy peace, but it worked. Frank Lucas had been part of Bumpy's inner circle since 1953. 15 years of watching, learning, understanding the mechanisms of power. But here's what most people missed. Frank wasn't just Bumpy's driver or bodyguard. He was studying the business model. When Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack that summer morning, the response was immediate. Within hours, every major player in New York's organized crime world knew. And they all understood what it meant. The treaty was over. The Italian family saw opportunity. Black independents like Nicky Barnes saw a throne up for grabs. Everyone assumed the same thing. Whoever stepped into that power vacuum would need traditional qualifications, connections to the 5 families, an army of soldiers, established territory. Frank Lucas had none of those things. What he did have was something nobody anticipated, a plan he'd been developing for years. Here's where Frank's thinking separated him from everyone else in that moment. Most people saw Bumpy's death as chaos, a scramble for territory, a war waiting to happen. Frank saw it as a market correction. The question wasn't who's strongest. The question was who understands what power actually means in this context. Traditional gangster logic said you take power through force and intimidation. Frank understood something different. In Harlem, power came from legitimacy. Bumpy hadn't controlled Harlem through fear. He'd controlled it through respect. He was seen as someone who protected the community's interests against outside exploitation. Frank needed to signal 2 things simultaneously: that he had the resources to be taken seriously, and that he represented continuity with Bumpy's vision, not a disruption of it. This is where the funeral strategy was born.
The Abyssinian Baptist Church funeral was scheduled for 3 days after Bumpy's death. Frank had 72 hours to execute his plan. First move, liquidate everything. Frank went to Chase Manhattan Bank and withdrew his entire savings, 15 years of careful accumulation. The exact amount? $100,000 in cash. In 1968 dollars, this represented roughly 6 years of average American household income. It was an enormous sum to simply withdraw in cash. His wife's reaction tells you everything about how insane this looked. Are you trying to get robbed or killed? But Frank understood something about demonstrations of power. It's not about having resources. It's about showing you're willing to deploy them in ways that seem irrational to others. The church was packed. 2,000 people, every significant figure in Harlem's criminal and political world. Front rows filled with the people who would decide Harlem's future. Frank arrived late. This wasn't disrespect, it was staging. He wanted everyone seated, everyone watching when he made his entrance. Black suit, black fedora, and a briefcase. Walking straight to Bumpy's casket, Frank did something nobody expected. He opened the briefcase and began placing stacks of $100 bills, $10,000 at a time, onto Bumpy's body. 10 stacks, $100,000. The church went silent. Why this worked? Let's break down the psychology of what just happened. Signal 1. Resources. Frank just demonstrated he could afford to literally bury money. In a room full of professional criminals, people whose entire lives were about accumulating and protecting money, Frank showed he had so much he could throw it away. Signal 2. Loyalty. In organized crime, loyalty is currency. Frank wasn't just showing respect to Bumpy, he was showing that he understood the code of the world he was entering. He honored his mentor in the most dramatic way possible. Signal 3. Audacity. Every mobster in that room was doing the same calculation. If he's willing to do this in front of witnesses, what else is he capable of? Signal 4. Community values. To the Harlem community watching, Frank wasn't being flashy for himself. He was honoring their fallen leader. He positioned himself as Bumpy's spiritual successor.
But Frank wasn't done. What happened next is where Frank's strategy became truly sophisticated. He addressed the entire church, not quietly, not privately, publicly, in front of everyone who mattered. The speech had 3 components. Part 1, establishing legitimacy. Frank positioned himself as Bumpy's chosen successor, invoking his mentor's authority. Part 2, drawing boundaries. He directly addressed the Italian families. The old arrangement was over. Harlem would now operate independently. Part 3, defining his difference. Frank made a promise that separated him from every other contender. He wasn't interested in fame or attention. He was interested in business. This last point was crucial. Nicky Barnes and others wanted to be visible, to be known. Frank was offering a different model, quiet competence. The room erupted, as you'd expect. Challenges, threats, outrage. But here's what mattered. Nobody could immediately dismiss him. The money in the casket changed everything. It gave Frank credibility that couldn't be argued away. You can dispute someone's capability, but you can't dispute $100,000 in cash. Frank left that funeral having accomplished something remarkable. He'd forced every major player to take him seriously. Whether they respected him or wanted him dead, they now had to consider him a factor.
Frank's meeting with Carmine Tremonti, acting boss of the Lucchese family, resulted in an agreement. 6 months to prove he could run Harlem independently. This wasn't generosity. The mob was betting Frank would fail. They expected chaos, violence, a power vacuum they could exploit. Frank needed to do 3 things: consolidate actual control of Harlem's operations, demonstrate he could maintain order, and prove his operation was more profitable than the old system. Nicky Barnes was Frank's first major challenge. Barnes had his own crew, his own ambitions, and no interest in working for someone he saw as Bumpy's former assistant. 3 days after the funeral, Barnes made a move, walked into one of Frank's heroin distribution points and claimed it for himself. Frank's response demonstrated his evolution from Bumpy's lieutenant to independent operator. He didn't start a war, he didn't make a public example. He went directly to Barnes, privately, and made a proposition that revealed sophisticated thinking about organizational structure. Frank offered Barnes a deal: become the public face of Harlem's drug operation, take the recognition, the reputation, the street fame. Meanwhile, Frank would control supply, distribution, and finances, the actual business. Barnes would be Mr. Untouchable. Frank would be invisible. This solved multiple problems simultaneously. Barnes got what he wanted, status and visibility. Frank got what he wanted, control and anonymity. And from the outside, it looked like Barnes was running things, which meant law enforcement attention went to Barnes, not Frank. This is where you see Frank's strategic sophistication. He wasn't trying to be the biggest gangster. He was trying to build the most efficient criminal enterprise.
But Frank's real innovation had nothing to do with Harlem politics. It was about supply chain economics. Here's how heroin reached Harlem in 1968. Opium was grown in Southeast Asia, primarily the Golden Triangle, Burma, Laos, Thailand.
It was refined into heroin in labs controlled by Corsican criminals in Marseille, France, the French Connection. This heroin was then sold to Italian crime families in the United States, who distributed it to black dealers in cities like Harlem. At each step, someone took a cut. By the time heroin reached Harlem street dealers, it had been marked up 500 to 1,000%, and because it passed through multiple hands, it was repeatedly diluted. Street-level heroin was often less than 10% pure. Frank saw the fundamental inefficiency: too many middlemen, too much markup, inferior product. His solution? Eliminate the middlemen entirely. In 1969, Frank did something unprecedented in American drug trafficking. He went to the source. Using contacts developed through military personnel he'd met in Harlem, Frank traveled to Bangkok, then into the Golden Triangle region. He negotiated directly with Thai and Chinese suppliers. The economics were transformative. Italian suppliers charged $50,000 per kilogram for 10% pure heroin. Direct from Southeast Asia, $4,000 per kilogram for 95% pure heroin. This wasn't just a better deal, it was a complete restructuring of the business model.
The logistics problem was obvious. How do you smuggle massive quantities of heroin from Southeast Asia to New York without detection? Frank's solution was both brilliant and morally horrific. He used military supply chains. During the Vietnam War, bodies of American service members killed in action were shipped home in sealed coffins. These coffins moved through military channels, were treated with reverence, and were never inspected by customs. Frank bribed U.S. military supply sergeants to hide heroin in these coffins. Let's be clear about what this means. Frank Lucas used the bodies of dead American soldiers as drug mules. It's one of the most disturbing aspects of his operation, a profound violation that shows the moral emptiness at the core of his enterprise. But from a pure business perspective, it was devastatingly effective. Frank branded his product Blue Magic, distinctive blue-tinted heroin that was dramatically purer than anything else available. Because he could cut it 9 times and still have it be stronger than competitors' uncut product, Frank had enormous flexibility. He could sell at lower prices, undercutting competition, maintain higher margins, making more profit, ensure consistent quality, building customer loyalty. Within 18 months, Frank Lucas controlled an estimated 80% of Harlem's heroin trade. He was making approximately $1 million per day. By the end of his 6-month test period with the Italian mob, Frank had demonstrated something undeniable. He was making more money than Bumpy ever had, with less violence and better organization. The Italian families respected the result, even if they didn't understand his methods. Frank had proven his model worked. From 1969 to 1974, Frank Lucas operated one of the most profitable drug enterprises in American history while remaining almost completely unknown to law enforcement. His strategy was simple: be boring. No flashy jewelry, no expensive cars parked in Harlem, no nightclub appearances, no public profile whatsoever. Frank lived in suburban New Jersey, drove modest vehicles, dressed conservatively. He looked like a successful businessman because that's what he was, just in an illegal industry. This wasn't personality, it was calculation. Frank had studied what happened to high-profile criminals. They either got killed by rivals or arrested by police. Bumpy Johnson himself had spent significant time in prison. Frank watched Nicky Barnes' court publicity and understood it was a countdown to imprisonment. Frank's model was to make money, not reputation.
On March 8, 1971, Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden, the fight of the century. Every celebrity, politician, and notable figure in America wanted to be there. Frank Lucas got ringside seats. And he made a decision that contradicts everything we know about his strategic thinking. He wore a $50,000 chinchilla fur coat. Floor length, impossible to miss, screaming, "I am extraordinarily wealthy." Why? We can speculate. Maybe Frank wanted just once to be visible. Maybe after years of invisibility, he wanted recognition. Maybe it was for his wife. Maybe it was simply ego, the same human weakness that eventually catches every criminal. Whatever the reason, it was devastating.
In the crowd that night was Richie Roberts, a detective with the Essex County Prosecutor's Office who specialized in narcotics cases. Roberts had been hearing whispers about Frank Lucas, fragments of information, unexplained cash flows, rumors of a major dealer nobody could identify. When he saw Frank in that coat, sitting ringside, Roberts knew he'd found his target. The investigation that followed took 4 years. Roberts was meticulous, building financial records, tracking associates, documenting supply chains. In 1975, Roberts and DEA agents raided Frank's home in Teaneck, New Jersey. They found $584,000 in cash hidden throughout the house, heroin, detailed financial records. Frank Lucas was arrested and charged with operating a continuing criminal enterprise, a federal charge that carried life imprisonment.
Facing life in prison, Frank made a choice that was either pragmatic or betrayal, depending on your perspective. He became a federal informant. Frank's cooperation was comprehensive. He provided information on Italian crime family drug operations, corrupt NYPD officers, including 3/4 of the elite Special Investigations Unit, the entire structure of his Southeast Asian supply chain, financial networks, and money laundering operations. His testimony led to over 100 arrests. The Special Investigations Unit, one of the NYPD's most decorated and supposedly elite detective squads, was revealed to be deeply corrupt, with officers stealing drugs and money while conducting investigations. For law enforcement, Frank's cooperation was invaluable. For the criminal world, it was unforgivable. Frank was initially sentenced to 70 years in federal prison. Through his cooperation, this was reduced to 15 years. He served 7, released in 1981. By the time Frank left prison, the world had changed. The heroin epidemic he'd helped fuel had devastated communities. The crack cocaine epidemic was beginning. Violence in drug markets had increased dramatically. Frank Lucas was a relic of a different era. Frank attempted to reintegrate. He worked with at-risk youth, speaking about the consequences of drug dealing. In interviews, Frank expressed some regret about the harm his operation caused, though he also often seemed to take pride in his business accomplishments, a contradiction that never fully resolved. In 2007, Frank served as a consultant on American Gangster, the film starring Denzel Washington. The movie took significant liberties with his story, but it cemented Frank's place in American crime mythology. Frank Lucas died on May 30, 2019, at age 88 from natural causes. Strip away the criminal context, and Frank Lucas's strategy reveals principles that apply to any competitive industry. Vertical integration. By controlling supply from source to distribution, Frank eliminated inefficiencies and markup. Brand differentiation. Blue Magic was recognizable and reliably superior, classic product branding. Operational security. His invisibility strategy mirrors corporate trade secret protection. Strategic partnerships. The arrangement with Nicky Barnes showed sophisticated organizational design, separating public relations from operations. These are principles taught in business schools. Frank applied them to heroin trafficking. But we cannot evaluate Frank Lucas purely as a business case study. His operation destroyed lives. Heroin addiction devastated communities, particularly in Harlem. Families were broken, people died. Frank's innovation made heroin cheaper and more available. That's not a neutral business achievement. It's a public health catastrophe. The soldiers whose coffins he used to smuggle drugs deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in a gangster's supply chain, but as people whose deaths were violated for profit. Frank's funeral gesture, that $100,000 in Bumpy's casket, was about respect, but respect built on an industry that showed fundamental disrespect for human life creates an unresolvable paradox. Frank claimed to honor Bumpy's memory by continuing his work, but Bumpy's work was predicated on drug distribution that harmed the very community both men claimed to represent. Was Frank Lucas brilliant? By certain metrics, yes. He saw opportunities others missed, executed a complex international operation, and outmaneuvered both competitors and law enforcement for years. But intelligence in service of destruction is not admirable, it's tragic. The same strategic thinking that built a $1 million-a-day enterprise could have built legitimate businesses, could have created value rather than harm.
Frank's story ends with a lesson he himself articulated. The moment you need people to know you're powerful, you've already lost. That chinchilla coat was Frank's confession. After years of disciplined invisibility, he wanted, just once, to be seen, and it cost him everything. Power that needs to be displayed is insecure power. True strategic advantage comes from being underestimated, from operating where others aren't looking. Frank knew this intellectually, but knowing and living by principles are different things. The funeral where Frank Lucas put $100,000 in Bumpy Johnson's casket wasn't just a dramatic moment in crime history. It was a perfect encapsulation of Frank's entire philosophy. Make a statement so bold that people have to reconsider everything they assumed about you. For 5 years, it worked. But the same need for recognition that drove that funeral gesture eventually drove him to wear that coat, to be visible, to be seen. And that's perhaps the most human part of Frank Lucas's story. He had the discipline to build an empire in shadow, but he couldn't fully escape the human desire to be acknowledged. In the end, Frank Lucas was neither the hero of his own story, nor simply a villain. He was something more complicated, a brilliant strategist who applied intelligence to an industry built on human suffering, who showed loyalty to individuals while harming communities, who demonstrated sophisticated business thinking while pursuing a fundamentally destructive enterprise. The briefcase at Bumpy's funeral bought Frank respect, reputation, and a throne. The chinchilla coat at the boxing match cost him everything. That's the complete story, how one display of audacity launched an empire, and how another display of vanity destroyed it. Both moments reveal the same truth. In the criminal underworld, as in life, the distance between genius and self-destruction is often just a single decision. Frank Lucas, 1930-2019. This documentary was created for educational purposes, examining historical events and strategic decision-making in organized crime. It does not glorify or endorse criminal activity.